Empire and industrialization, two forces that completely transformed our world between 1800 and 1914. During this pivotal period, steam engines, telegraphs, and machine guns enabled European powers to conquer vast territories, setting in motion global relationships that still shape our lives today. What we were exploring isn't just distant history, it's the origin story of our modern global society, realizing how technological innovation became a pathway to unprecedented power and control. The decisions made during these decades created patterns of wealth, power, and inequality that continue to define international relations to our time. Our guiding question is simple but profound. How were industrial empires created and contested? And how did these processes shape our world today? We'll tackle this in three key parts. First, we'll examine how industrial powers built their empires using new technologies and ideas. Second, we'll explore the struggles and conflicts that erupted as empire builders encountered resistance. Finally, we'll connect these historical processes to our contemporary world, showing how the echoes of empire continue to influence everything from economic development to cultural identity. This framework helps us understand not just what happened, but why it matters right now. Before we dive deeper, let's get our terms straight. Imperialism and colonialism are related but distinct concepts that help us understand this period. Imperialism refers to the set of ideas, beliefs, and justifications that made empire building seem necessary or even beneficial to imperial powers. Think of it as the theory of empire. Colonialism, on the other hand, is the practice, the actual experience of conquest, rule, and resistance that shaped daily life in colonized societies. By examining both, we can understand not only how empires were justified, but also how they functioned on the ground and affected real people's lives. Why were empires of this period so different from anything that came before? Think about it this way. Industrial technology completely changed the game. First, military technology created overwhelming advantages. Machine guns could defeat much larger forces armed with traditional weapons. Second, communication networks like telegraphs and railways allowed imperial powers to coordinate across vast distances, making global control possible. Third, these technological advances enabled empires to grow to unprecedented scale, covering a huge proportion of the globe and connecting diverse regions in new ways. The result? A dramatic shift in global power relations that favored industrialized nations. What drove nations to build empires? The motivations boiled down to three key factors. Economic interests were paramount. Growing factories needed raw materials like cotton, rubber, and minerals, while manufacturers needed new markets for their products. Political competition created a scramble for colonies as European powers sought to outdo each other in territorial acquisition and national prestige. And ideologically, imperial powers developed theories of racial superiority and the civilizing mission to justify their conquests, framing domination as beneficial to the conquered peoples, whether these peoples wanted this help or not. Building an empire required specific tools, and industrial powers had three crucial advantages. Superior military technology meant conflicts were often devastatingly one-sided. European forces with machine guns and artillery could defeat much larger indigenous armies. Transportation networks like railways, steamships, and telegraph lines allowed rapid deployment of forces and efficient administration of distant territories. Administrative systems were developed to govern conquered peoples, often employing scientific management techniques that prioritized resource extraction and control rather than local development or well-being. The economic structure of empire followed a clear three-step pattern that funneled wealth to imperial powers. First came extraction. Colonies were forced to produce raw materials like cotton, rubber, minerals, and agricultural products that their colonizers needed. Next, production. These raw materials were shipped to factories in Europe where they were manufactured into finished goods. Finally, markets. These finished products were then sold back to colonized populations, often at inflated prices. This cycle created wealth for imperial nations while keeping colonies dependent and underdeveloped, a pattern some historians called unequal exchange. Empire created rigid social structures that divided populations and concentrated power. At the top were citizens of imperial power, Europeans living in the colonies who maintained full political rights and privileges. Below them were colonial elites, local people given limited authority to help administer imperial rule. At the bottom were the vast majority of the population, colonial subjects, with few rights and little political voice. These hierarchies were often justified through racial theories and created deep divisions within colonial societies, many of which persisted long after formal colonialism ended. Let's see how colonialism worked in practice. In Vietnam, French colonizers dramatically transformed the capital city of Hanoi after taking control in 1883. They demolished traditional neighborhoods and constructed European style boulevards and buildings. The city was deliberately segregated, with French districts in the desirable center and Vietnamese neighborhoods relegated to the outskirts. In rural areas, the French converted small farms that fed local populations into vast rubber plantations to supply French industry. This transformation prioritized French economic interests while disrupting Vietnamese society and creating new patterns of inequality. In Ghana, then called the Gold Coast, British colonialism brought different but equally profound changes. Traditional governance systems were disrupted and replaced with British controlled structures that undermined local authority. Economic exploitation was systematic. Ghana's gold, timber, and later coca were extracted for British profit, while trade restrictions prevented Ghanans from selling directly to other nations. Colonial education introduced English language and British cultural values, creating new social divisions between those with Western education and those without, divisions that remained influential long after independence. Not all imperialism involved direct territorial control. China shows how imperial powers could dominate without formal colonization. The Opium Wars forced China to accept unfavorable trade agreements, including the legalization of opium imports that devastated Chinese society. Unequal treaties undermined Chinese sovereignty and through forced trade concessions, extraterritoriality for Europeans, which meant exemption from Chinese laws, and foreign control of customs duties. This economic domination occurred without direct political control, showing how imperial power could function through economic leverage, creating what some historians call informal empire. How did colonized peoples understand their experience? Jomo Kenyatta, who later became Kenya's first president, wrote a revealing fable. In Gentleman of the Jungle, an elephant asks to put his trunk inside a man's hut during a rainstorm. Gradually, the elephant pushes his whole body in, forcing the man out. When the man protests, a condition of inquiry, composed entirely of other animals, rules in favor of the elephant, declaring it economic to use the space that way. This powerful allegory captures how colonial powers used seemingly fair practices and the language of improvement to justify taking land and resources, while excluding the colonized from meaningful participation in decisions. How did imperial powers justify their rule? They developed three main arguments. The civilizing mission claimed Europeans were bringing progress, Christianity, and superior culture to backwards peoples. Economic arguments promoted the idea that colonies needed European direction to develop their resources and join the modern economy. Paternalistic attitudes framed colonial subjects as childlike and incapable of self-governance, requiring European guidance, a perspective that conveniently ignored sophisticated pre-colonial governance systems and the self-interested nature of colonial rule. Colonial subjects didn't just accept imperial rule. They actively resisted in various ways. Direct confrontation included military action by organized forces fighting against colonial armies, like the Ethiopian victory over Italian forces at Adwa in 1896. Large-scale rebellions such as the Sepoy Mutiny in India and the Boxer Rebellion in China challenged imperial authority, though they often faced brutal suppression. Organized protests demonstrated colonial subjects' rejection of foreign rule, even when they lacked the military power to overthrow it. These forms of resistance openly challenged imperial authority despite the risks involved. When direct confrontation was too dangerous, colonial subjects found creative ways to resist. Work slowdowns, deliberately misunderstanding orders, and small acts of sabotage disrupted colonial economies without directly challenging authorities. Cultural preservation, maintaining traditional practices, languages, and beliefs, became a way to resist cultural imperialism and maintain identity. Resistance philosophies developed by intellectuals challenged the ideological foundations of empire and laid groundwork for future independence movements. These less visible forms of resistance were often more difficult for colonial authorities to suppress. The economic impacts of empire shape our world today. Global wealth inequality that emerged during this period persists. The double hump distribution, showing former colonized nations with much higher per capita wealth than formerly colonized regions. Economic dependencies established during colonialism continue to influence trade patterns, with many former colonies still exporting raw materials and importing manufactured goods. Local economies transformed to serve imperial interests often struggle to diversify and develop balanced economic structures even decades after independence, showing how deeply colonial patterns became embedded. Politically, empire left equally lasting legacies. Independence movements that emerged from colonial resistance fundamentally challenged the global political landscape after World War II. Borders drawn by colonial powers with little regard for cultural or ethnic realities created conflicts that continue today in many regions of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Governance structures established during colonialism often persisted after independence, with new nations sometimes inheriting administrative systems designed for extraction rather than development, what scholars call colonial communities. The cultural legacies of empire remain deeply embedded in societies worldwide. European languages became official languages in many former colonies, influencing education systems and creating linguistic hierarchies that often privileged those fluent in the colonizer's language. Social divisions established during colonial rule frequently persisted, with access to colonial education creating privileged classes. Cultural identities were profoundly shaped by the colonial experience, leading to complex questions of authenticity, hybridity, and cultural decolonization that continue to be negotiated today in literature, art, education, and popular culture. The transition from empire to nation states represented a fundamental reorganization of the global political order. Decolonization movements challenged imperial rule, often drawing on both nationalist sentiments and international concepts of self determination. However, the end of former empire didn't mean the end of imperial influence. Economic relationships, political alliances, and cultural connections established during colonialism continued to shape international relations. This persistence of imperial patterns, despite formal independence, have led some scholars to describe the post colonial era as one of neo colonialism, where power imbalances continue in new forms. As we wrap up, it's clear these imperial legacies continue to shape our contemporary world. From economic development challenges to political conflicts and cultural identities, understanding both imperialism and colonialism isn't just academic history, it's essential for comprehending the roots of global inequality, international tensions, and cultural dynamics that affect our lives today. By connecting these historical processes to present realities, we gain insight into why certain patterns persist and how they might be addressed. The story of empire isn't just about the past, it's about understanding the foundations of our present and the possibilities for our future.